Today, we will be covering Stuck on SharePoint 2013, what's next and how we get there. So covering some migration strategies for you. Before we get started, just a few rules. Please ask questions in the chat window that you have access to in your Zoom window. You've all come in on mute, so please stay muted throughout the presentation. Once we're done, there will be time for questions. So if we don't follow up with your questions in the chat window in the moment, we will follow up with all of the questions asked at the end. We will send you a link to the recording following the webinar for reference, but feel free to take notes if you want to as we go along, but just know that you will receive the recording and the presentation following this webinar. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Kelly Snicola, Executive Vice President over our colleague, Security, Cloud and Infrastructure and CRM practices here at Forelli. Presenting today is one of our senior consultants, Jeremy Hearn. I'm a little bit biased, but I do think that he's one of the top SharePoint consultants in the nation, and he will be sharing some migration tips and tricks and options for you moving forward. I'll hand it over to you, Jeremy.
Well, thanks so much, Kelly, and thanks everybody for joining. I really appreciate you showing up, and I see some familiar faces here, and I see one face who enjoyed the matinee show this morning and decided to return for the primetime broadcast. So welcome, 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 and thanks again. Okay, as we are apt to do, we open our presentation with a poll. And today's questions is what challenges are you facing in upgrading or migrating legacy SharePoint? And your options would be, I don't have a clear roadmap of how to do it. I don't have the technical knowledge for an upgrade or migration. I feel we'll have difficulty migrating customizations. I don't feel like I know my options, all of the above and other.
And we'll give everybody just a few seconds to respond to that poll. Okay. It looks like the alls have it, Jeremy, with the majority going to all of the above. Then we have a tie for I don't have a clear roadmap of how to do it. I don't have the technical knowledge for an upgrade or migration. I don't feel like I know my options, and other.
Okay. Well, I would say that we're probably going to address a few of these pretty directly in this presentation. So I hope the content here helps somebody out today. So that being said, I think we can move into the content. So just an overview of this presentation, and what we're going to talk about today is just the current state of affairs, where I'm going to make some assumptions of where you might be, because despite your individual pain points with SharePoint and Portal and things like that, most of the schools we work with have more in common than they do different. So current state of affairs is number one. The two most common options for upgrading and migrating is going to be topic two, and how we make informed decisions to plot our path forward is going to close it out. So that being said, let's talk about the current state of affairs. If you're attending this presentation, I believe that there is a good chance that you're currently using SharePoint 2013. You might still be using SharePoint 2010. SharePoint 2013, obviously the most common we see in the higher ed landscape for good reason these days. And we do still have a couple of customers on 2010 who are kind of going through the same pain that you might be having in 2013. This system serves as your primary portal or intranet. You're also very likely using the Ellucian portal product and possibly ILP. And for those who aren't using it, that stands for Intelligent Learning Platform. And that is basically a linkage between your portal, your LMS, and your ERP, so they can share data. ILP would basically surface LMS data in your portal through a web part. Your existing systems are end of life in terms of Microsoft support, or they are close to it. I'm guessing most of you probably know that, Server 2008 and a lot of the older software from that period is already end of life. There's no support, there's no updates for it. Server 2012 is right there as well. You've also probably been frustrated by SharePoint, and looking around the room with some of the people I know, we've had some conversations about that frustration. So don't worry, it is not uncommon. You are not alone, and you might also not be sure where to go next. Okay, if you meet any of the criteria that we've just discussed, You're probably exposed to some security vulnerabilities by not being able to patch end of life systems, or that might be you within the coming months. You may have built your Lucian portal in the great portal gold rush of 2013, and it hasn't grown or been adopted like you thought it'd be. And me saying portal gold rush of 2013, I'm really just saying there seem to have been a lot of schools who, with a Lucian's guidance or whoever they worked with, sort of had this vision of if you build it, they will come, and set up a portal with a couple of landing pages. And, there are schools that have made the effort, and they've made some customizations, they've developed things, they've had a lot of content added. There are other schools where their portals look just about like they did today. They look just like they did when they installed it years ago. You may also be dedicating IT staff, resources, and time to maintaining a SharePoint farm that has a fairly large footprint, perhaps larger than you'd like it to be. At a minimum, a SharePoint production environment usually runs on about 3 servers. Depending on the size of your school, our largest school has 10 or 11 servers. So that's a lot of resources. And, not everybody has an appetite for that all the time. Okay. So you've really got 2 paths to take when we're talking about the Microsoft world of things. You've got an upgrade option, and that's the one we're going to talk about first. And that's really, how do I get from SharePoint 2013 to the next version, 2016? And at that point, you've staved off like the end of life concerns and things like that for another few years. You've gone to a newer version and you're supported. The other branch of that we'll get into when we're done talking about an on-prem upgrade is migrating to SharePoint Online, which is obviously, a SaaS model living in the cloud, part of Microsoft 365. So many of our clients are unaware that Lucian rolled out support for SharePoint 2016 via Lucian Portal 5 in Q4 of 2019. I remember it like it was last year. It came out after Thanksgiving without a whole lot of fanfare or press release or anything like that, but it is available. Forelli has successfully upgraded several schools to the new versions, and in the process, we've tried to improve topologies, configurations, addressing SharePoint pain points that they might have had in their previous version in the process. So in addition to doing an upgrade, we've tried to, listen to what issues might be and address those issues in the next version. So hopefully life gets easier there. The good news about doing this is that the upgrade process is fairly straightforward using the Microsoft database attach methodology and migration scripts provided by Lucian. What this means is that Microsoft's official upgrade path, if you're just a SharePoint user, a Lucian portal aside, I could be any organization using on-prem SharePoint. I'm basically going to take my databases off of my database server in 2013. I'm going to build a 16 farm. I'm going to attach my databases to that. And there's some built-in upgrade processes that are going to go through and upgrade version specific stuff to make your 2013 content work with 2016. Additionally, Lucian has done a pretty good job of providing some migration scripts to upgrade their end of things. That's going to update the Lucian web parts, features, dependencies, things like that. They've got scripts that do that, and they tend to work pretty well. So there's some pros and cons of staying on-prem, as I'm sure a lot of you know. But the first one I've kind of already talked about. You get a direct migration path. It's very apples to apples coming from 2013 to 2016. You're not going to have a lot of cleanup work. You're not going to do a lot of rebuilding. You don't have to make any other major changes. What you had in 2013, you could have on 16 pretty painlessly. The life cycle on this is that your support for SharePoint itself is going to go until 7/14/2026, and I put at least in parentheses, because in past versions of SharePoint, Microsoft has continued to roll out cumulative updates, and they've continued to roll out security updates via Windows Update for versions that are supposed to already be end of life. So 7/14/2026 at least. There are several major improvements over 2013. They've added a feature called MinRoll, which is really like topology for dummies. If you remember those like dummies books that were like on Walden Books shelves back in the day, or Barnes and Noble today. And what that really does is, if you've ever gone through the pain of like deciding like what service should live on what SharePoint server, Microsoft's identified some roles, and they've said, okay, this is a web front end, and best practices dictate that these 2 or 3 services run on your web front end. this other server is an application server, and these 7, 8, 9 applications, they should run on an application server. So if I, as an admin, go in and I try to provision a service on the wrong server, SharePoint's going to tell me, and it's going to put a little fix button there, and it's going to move it kind of automatically. It's a nice feature. It's made installing it nicer. It's really made consistency across farms nicer. The user profile service is a bit of a problem child. Depending on what day, week, or month it is. It can be one of my most common like tech support requests. It has a synchronization service if you use the default option for synchronizing. And that synchronization service tends to stop and not want to start again, or it can get stuck on starting. And when it's stuck on starting, you try and stop it. It gets stopped on stopping. And now you're in the business of running a lot of PowerShell to get this thing back on track. Not a lot of people have an appetite for that. Under the hood, that was based on Forefront Identity Manager. Not a lot of schools needed the functionality that really brought to the table, which was kind of a bi-directional communication aspect, meaning I could write back to Active Directory with it and not just read things from Active Directory. They've dropped that in favor of just a straight Active Directory synchronization process, and the thing is a lot less problematic. So getting that one out of there alone is a big win. The other big pro is that it's going to be less restrictive, especially for development. If you've done any custom development against SharePoint on-prem, the things that you've been doing are still okay, and you're still going to be able to do them. And I would say that includes, forms, .NET development, things that you've turned into like WSPs and deployed to SharePoint. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that deeper into the presentation. So there are definitely some cons to staying with SharePoint 2016 on-prem, and I'm sure we're all aware that there's cons for that. But one of the biggest ones, I think, and I think a lot of you would agree, is that you'd continue to have an on-prem farm with a footprint consisting of at least 3 servers, and that's going to be a SQL server, an application server, and a web front end. Yes, that's the minimum. It's also not terribly common. I gave another extreme example of the school with 10 or 11 servers. Typically people are going to have 4 or 5. They're usually going to have multiple web front ends, and you're going to do some load balancing there for fault tolerance, that kind of thing. But that's a fairly substantial footprint, right? By the time you get into min specs on these SharePoint servers, and you've got 4 cores per server, 16 gigs of RAM on your SharePoint server, you might have given SQL 20 or 24 gigs of space, and you've got a lot of drive space going out the window on these things too. You might have 100 gigs for a C drive, for the OS drive. The SQL, you've got your data logs, backup drives, things like that. So yeah, resource intensive. A need for on-prem SharePoint administration skills are staffed through a partner. So, the SharePoint support is kind of a special role, and that's a special skill set for people who know SharePoint. That tends to roll in SharePoint specific stuff. It tends to roll in a bit of SQL. It tends to roll in like a bit of web development, and even maybe like some Windows system administration. It's not always easy to find that person. And sometimes if you do find that person, you might have something you'd rather have them working on. And I think the poster children for that in my life at Forelli are on this call right now. So hi, my friends who will remain anonymous. Continued dependence on WebAdvisor for self-service web part integration at the present time. So what that means is there's, if you're using the Ellucian portal, there's a web part called the self-service web part, which is kind of a misnomer in itself. It's really linking in the back end to WebAdvisor. You've got kind of an invisible instance of WebAdvisor that this thing goes to retrieve data and display in the portal. That hasn't changed in SharePoint 2016 and Ellucian Portal 5. We'll talk a little bit more about some rumors and speculation on that later in the presentation. We've also heard from several clients that they feel like they're kicking the can down the road by not moving to the cloud now. And there are some caveats to that as well that I plan on getting into a little bit more deeply. Okay. So I definitely need to talk about security here, and security specifically for SharePoint is like a lot of your other web systems. It's going to have a lot of like the same kind of pain points. But if you stay on-prem, you're still going to be responsible for proper permissions and management of those permissions for admins, users, and groups. Obviously, that's not going to go away. It could not be anybody else's responsibility. If somebody should or shouldn't have access to something, that's on you. You've got to harden systems, and that could entail locking down ports. It could entail like hardening web applications, managing your security certificates that are now coming up every single year. removing insecure protocols and ciphers. That's getting rid of the ability for your servers to serve traffic over like old SSL 3.0, TLS 1.0, 1.1, that sort of thing. So you're going to have to go through some initial hardening and probably, as times change, revisit that. And don't forget about endpoint protection in that process. You're still going to have your Windows Defenders or whatever your antivirus suite is on these servers to protect those things. You're also, because they're in your data center, just like everything else in your data center, you're going to be placing them behind firewalls and proxies designed to reduce your attack surface area. If you've got a really nice firewall, you might be getting some intrusion detection benefits out of that, right? Still on you. Anything that you'd get in the cloud that would help handle this for you, you're not getting that benefit. So the other thing is you're also in the business of keeping your systems patched and up to date. For those of you who may have had some hands-on experience patching SharePoint, applying CUs, it can be kind of a pain and it can sometimes go wrong, and there is some troubleshooting that you need to do to get it back on track. The other common thing that I really see with patching is I see people like let Windows Update handle the SharePoint patching, which became available a few years back. And the problem I see there is, yes, it's gone and gotten me SharePoint updates the way that it's gotten, other Windows Server updates, but then people forget to run that PS config tool, which is still needed to commit those changes. In fact, we have one school we're working with now. They've got like 4 years of these updates pending that they've been letting Windows Update apply, but nobody's ever once run PS config to increment SharePoint's build number to the current version. So we're going to have a really fun session and be taking a lot of snapshots to rectify that situation. Okay. So if I harass you about security, I've also got to harass you about disaster recovery. And on-prem, the DR is still up to you. So you're going to be taking backups via one or several of the following methods. You've got your SQL database backups, you've got your server and file system backups. And in there, I would also include, like if you're taking backups of like an entire VM, I would put that in that category. You've also got third-party backup solutions that might utilize like a SharePoint or a SQL agent that's aware of that content. So just breaking these down a little bit, if you've got SQL backups, you can restore a farm to its former glory. You might have to rebuild some servers in the event of a catastrophe, but as long as you've got your backend data, you can get your web applications back. There might be some customizations on a file system or something, but like those SQL database backups to me are key. Server and file system backups as well. If you run into a catastrophe, yes, you can restore a server. Getting into what is and is not okay in a SharePoint DR scenario is kind of beyond the scope of this, and I could spend like an hour on that, but it is kind of complicated. And as far as third-party backup solutions that might utilize like an agent, some of the more popular ones that we see out there, and most of our customers are already using like one of 3 backup solutions. Like when we go in somewhere, I almost always see the same 3. And they do have these agents available. And the nice thing is, like, if somebody from accounting deletes a document, a month ago, and it's not in the recycle bins for SharePoint anymore, and you need to just restore that one document, you can restore it right back to its original place of origin in a SharePoint site. And that's better. It's a better recovery scenario than having to do like a SQL database restore, find that bit of content, export it somewhere, probably in your test environment, and bring it back into your production farm. So yeah, take backups, take them the right way. And when you are taking your backups, make sure to test your backups. We ask this question a lot and we kind of get some blank stares or some uncomfortable silences. So verify your backups are valid and they can be restored periodically. Restore a SQL database to a test instance. It's a good way to do a prod to test clone anyway. Restore it, make sure it's valid, run those fire drills, and make sure they meet your recovery point and recovery time objectives. How long does it take me to recover? How recent of a backup do I really need to make sure I'm covered? Most clients need to be able to do point in time restores, meaning if it's like, if I have a catastrophe at 11 a.m., I need to restore back at 10 a.m. I can't go back to last Sunday's backup. And these are real world scenarios. We run into this, like people run like one full backup a week. And we ask them like, Okay, if you had a disaster strike on a Friday and you had to roll back, what are you rolling back to? And they say Sunday. And we kind of wonder if that becomes a resume generating event for somebody, because most schools we know don't have the appetite for losing 5 days of data. In an active SharePoint environment, there could have been a lot of changes in that time. Meeting minutes and things like that that you don't even think of are definitely important to some users in your organization. Trust me, we've seen it. So keeping your backups in 2 places is still a thing. You know, think about ransomware and where can't ransomware impact my backup sets. We actually have something in flight right now dealing with like a ransomware case where I'm sure that client wishes that they had their backups in a second place that was not accessible from their network. Okay. So like I said, 2 forks in the road, that's fork 1. You can kind of stay the course, you can stay on-prem, and you can do an upgrade to 2016. Just a few other items about that before we move to the cloud. We've seen Ellucian literature forecasting SharePoint 2019 support and ending the reliance on Web Advisor via Web API, which is the same mechanism that self-service uses to get data from colleague for that web client. A date for that is obviously to be decided or to be announced. We have not heard anything official on that other than seeing it in sales literature. We do believe SharePoint 2016 on-prem is still a great option for schools who were successfully able to manage SharePoint 2013. If it was really unruly for you, you know, we don't want to sign you up for another 4 or 5 years of that. But, you know, if you had an okay experience with it, 2016 for that reason and maybe some other reasons might still be a valid choice. Okay, so that other branch of the road is migrating to SharePoint Online. And I'm sure everybody knows, but a SharePoint Online environment is just SharePoint integrated into Microsoft 365. It's offered as a service to clients with 365 tenants, and as a service, it still offers the ability to create sites, lists, libraries, and allows users to collaborate and automate in a variety of ways. Basically, it's going to look, act, and feel like an on-prem SharePoint environment most of the time. So what does a SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint Online migration look like? Because it is going to be much different than that direct database attach method and your Ellucian scripts. The migration model really centers around using a Microsoft or third-party tool to pick up and move your content in a much more granular way than the database attach migration would. The database attach method basically takes everything in one fell swoop and moves it. When you use these migration tools, they tend to be very hierarchical in nature, in that, you know, you get a top level like web application site collection, and it trickles down into like sites and document libraries and things. And you have the ability, sure, you can put a checkbox at the top and say move everything, or you can go down and just check the things you care about moving and pick their destination and move them there. And it probably really is a good time to like ask yourself questions about, you know, what's needed and what's not needed. You don't really want to move into your new house and take all your trash with you, right? You probably want to leave some of that behind. You might want to make some decisions around your taxonomy and possible changes to it. And in SharePoint Online, that actually might be a necessity to some degree. So basically, migration tools let you pick and choose what you want to move and where to move it. They've also usually got the ability to include existing security groups, meaning like in SharePoint on-prem, if I had my owners, members, and visitors group for people with, you know, full control, edit, and read access on the site, it's going to respect those. It's actually going to recreate those and put your members back into them. And, you know, if you do this type of migration, there is a high probability that you're going to have to clean up your existing content, maybe some formatting, things like that. I would say mostly for the better. Ellucian got a lot of us off to a good start with like their implementations of Bootstrap. They had some out of the box master pages that most of us have customized and applied our own branding to. That's going to go away in the cloud. So you're going to have to basically be ready for that. And you're probably going to be basically improving the appearance and getting it back to something you want it to look like. Okay. So additionally, you may rebuild portions of your taxonomy. I touched on that a minute ago, which could be a good or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it and how well your current one works for you. So if you haven't really thought about taxonomy, what I'm referring to in this case is like I might have like a slash departments, and that's where I put my departments. I'm on-prem, I might have a slash teams, and that's where I put, my collaboration sites. I might have like a students branch where I put, clubs and orgs and things like that that are going to pertain to students to kind of keep that stuff logically grouped together. There's a pretty good chance that online you're going to want to make some changes to that taxonomy. It might not make sense to have it the same way there. And the way that site inheritance and things work online, it's a little different, but there's also some better tools for the job in a SharePoint Online scenario. So creating an intranet experience definitely requires familiarity with some new assets and concepts. Hub sites are going to be a big one. That's really SharePoint Online's way to say, okay, I've grouped some disparate sites together, but I want them all to have a common navigation and branding. So to put that maybe into a little finer point on that, you might want to create a student's landing page in SharePoint Online, and you might want to make your student clubs and orgs hub sites. And if you have changes in branding or navigation that are just pertain to students, that's a good way to do it in one place and have it inherit to all these other student targeting sites. So there's also SharePoint Online specific navigation types. There's basically there's a small menu and a mega menu, for lack of better terms. And though that menuing is going to basically be tied to the type of team or the type of site template that you use when you create that. The bottom line here is there's going to be a lot of manual intervention to get SharePoint Online looking and acting the way you want it to look, and to be properly structured, versus your on-prem migration where you can probably be pretty status quo about that. Okay, so pros and cons of moving to SharePoint Online. One of the biggest pros here, I think, is going to be it removes your on-prem server farm. We've already talked that can have a fairly large footprint. So if that gets you out of the business of managing that infrastructure related to that farm, that can be a really good thing. That includes patching and updates. New features are going to be rolled out automatically as well, for the same reason. Microsoft handles the updating. We're not aware of any downtime that happens when Microsoft does their patching and their updates. They do tend to communicate pretty well when new features are coming out and when they have been rolled out, but you're out of the business. You're probably of patching and doing updates, and you're probably not going to have any downtime associated with that. So that alone is a pretty big win. It does fit well into cloud strategies for clients already using 365 and/or Azure. And what I mean by that is SharePoint's really one piece of a bigger pie. In 365 alone, you're really going to have what I would call your Office Online components, your Word, Excel, things like that operate in the browser. You've got SharePoint Online, which we're obviously discussing. It acts just like SharePoint on-prem, but in the cloud. You're going to have OneDrive, which is really like bulk file storage. You're going to have Microsoft Teams, which is really like, a true collaboration tool with its own dedicated UI. And on the Azure side, there are clients that are already doing some degree of virtualization there. They might be running like an offsite DR in Azure where they've got some virtual machines spun up there. We've seen people hosting like SQL databases there, whether it's a dedicated SQL instance or it's, the service hosted model where you just upload your database and you never actually have to manage the SQL instance. You never have to see it. Probably one of the biggest ones we see is people taking advantage of Azure Enterprise apps SSO. That's become a really, really popular SSO solution, mainly because if you're already licensed for a lot of like the Azure 365 stuff, it basically just comes along at no additional cost, and it's been a really solid product and has enjoyed like really good compatibility with a lot of your relying party applications that you need to sign into. So if you're already using a lot of that other stuff, maybe there's advantages to that. Maybe it really simplifies your life moving SharePoint to the cloud. Probably one of the big wins here is frees up IT staff dedicated to SharePoint infrastructure to do other things. And we tend to think that those same people can be a lot more proactive in improving content, improving the portal experience, improving branding, optimizing search experience. These are all things that are really going to allow you to like grow and expand your portal instead of just trying to maintain it day to day. And it really is moving from reactive to proactive, which is obviously a good place to be. And just to give like a concrete example of that, we hear a lot of times that like SharePoint search doesn't do everything we want it to do, or users complain that they're not actually finding the information they want with it. Under the hood, if you know where to look, search is actually pretty good about giving you some metrics on what people are searching for, what they ultimately found, that kind of thing. There are things you can do to promote content within search, and frankly, a lot of people just don't have the time for it. So if you had time to do that stuff, search might become viable and you might be providing a better user experience because of it. And I would say same with content. If you've got metrics on your content to say, okay, our landing pages are obviously high trafficked as they should be, but what's some other content that we feel is important that's not receiving the traffic that we think it should be good at getting? At that point, you've got opportunities to promote that stuff, right? Like you could put it in a banner rotator on a landing page. You could send out communications. You could latch on to some marketing initiative to let people know this stuff is out there. But once again, reactive moving to proactive when you free up some of those IT staff dedicated to maintaining that infrastructure. And a little bit in jest, but we say it may improve the sleep of CIOs and application directors who worry about their on-prem SharePoint environment maybe going down. And I am calling this the SaaS, or sleep as a service model. Okay, there are definitely going to be some cons to going online as well. And in case you haven't guessed, Ellucian Portal and ILP are not coming along for the ride. They are not supported in SharePoint Online, and they are not supported for the same reason that any of your custom development that maybe you've done in .NET that gets deployed as something called a WSP is. Basically, these are deployment packages for SharePoint on-prem. SharePoint Online does not allow them. You can't deploy them there. They're just out of the question. Any development that you do is going to have to be done working with the client side object model, or CSOM. And that usually means JavaScript in most cases. Your code's not going to have any interaction with like the SharePoint object model or things under the hood on the server. You're really just doing presentational work in the UI to bring things in from other systems, perhaps using JavaScript. So just keep that in mind, because that's probably one of the biggest deal breakers that we've talked to people about. The branding experience is fairly different in the cloud, and it is a little bit more limited, but it is improving. So, 3-4 years ago, when you got into SharePoint Online, the only thing you could really do was kind of choose some colors for your theme. You could upload your logo, and that's kind of where we saw this stuff end. They've got some new branding tools out that actually do let you do a pretty deep dive into what's in my header, what's in my footer, how do I style certain objects. But once again, this is all fairly dependent on JavaScript. That's really a cornerstone of doing this stuff. So if you're used to working with master pages, page layouts, on-prem CSS, you're in for a bit of a change when you get to SharePoint Online. And basically, the creation of an intranet experience is going to require some new skills and concepts. So you're probably going to have to do some training with your people around that. Okay, so SharePoint Online security. As with on-prem, you're still going to have to ensure that you've got proper permissions and management of those permissions for admins, users, and groups. Even though this is technically possible on SharePoint on-prem, I'm only really pointing it out on SharePoint Online because that's really in real life the only place we see it. There are external sharing considerations. Right out of the box, I've got the ability to say, okay, so-and-so is not in my organization, but I can share this document to them anyway. And you can turn this off at multiple levels. Just know that you're going to be in the business of probably managing some external sharing security and expectations in the cloud as well. Like I've pointed out before, Microsoft is going to manage your patching update, and now I'm going to include certificates. So your yearly certificate that you now need to update on your web applications, Microsoft's going to handle that for you, and it gets you out of that business of having to come in on a Sunday night and roll those certificates over 2 weeks before they expire, or whatever your process is. And depending on the licensing that you choose, and I think this is probably one of the most compelling reasons, you may be eligible to harness the power of the Microsoft Cloud security tools related to protection, compliance, and data loss protection, or DLP. There is a site, it's protection.microsoft.com. There's a compliance.microsoft.com. And within those, there are a lot of really valuable and very polished tools, and the dashboards to these things are completely amazing. And I know even internally, our security people have been able to make great strides in our security using them. A lot of times in security, I kind of hear people struggle of getting like this single pane of glass for security stuff. And it sounds like Microsoft's done a really good job of that. So if you are on SharePoint Online, you're going to be able to harness some of those protection tools against that environment where you might not necessarily have them on-prem without spending money on like a third-party solution from another provider. Okay, so what about backups in the cloud? So Microsoft offers about 90 days of backup via the 2 stages of recycle bin that you get in SharePoint. Those of you who are SharePoint administrators on the call know that there is a user-facing recycle bin and there's a site collection recycle bin that site collection administrators can do restores from. Microsoft leans into that in the cloud. The actual number of days, I believe, is 93, and I don't think we can change that as administrators as we could on-prem. I think that's just the way it is. But that tends to be somebody deleted something, and I'm going to go back and restore it. And that can be a site, a list, a library, a specific app. These are all things that can live in a recycle bin and be restored. Probably not your solution for, data that got corrupted, or you need to do a rollback of a lot of things. This is going to be very granular. Microsoft compliance retention tools also allow a very comprehensive backup to be taken and stored long-term, but they're really not meant for DR. This is the kind of tool that's like, okay, our legal team is engaged in something and they needed to know what this data looked like on November 5th, 2020. And we've got a snapshot of all this data in time, and it could be my entire data set. The problem there is that the restore scenario, once again, is going to be very granular, and I'm going to be in the business of checking boxes for what I want to restore versus, let's just restore everything. And I'm not exactly sure what the limitations on that service are, like if I were using that for a daily backup. So I see a lot of people discussing this. I don't think it's a very good backup option. The third thing I would say is, through experience, we've kind of gotten to know that Microsoft support seems to have access to restore recent data when absolutely needed. I wouldn't recommend relying on this. They don't say a lot about it. It's just something we notice they seem to be able to do upon request. So those 3 things being said, use a third-party backup solution, secure your own data in a separate location, somewhere other than your Microsoft tenant. Don't necessarily take these backups and try and put them back up onto OneDrive in your tenant, put them somewhere else. Your current enterprise backup solution may already have the extensions or agents to back up Microsoft Cloud data. I alluded earlier to the fact that we kind of see 3 backup solutions across our client base most commonly, and all 3 of them have like a cloud extension that lets you back up cloud data and put it in with, your backup repository. So if you are going to the cloud, please, please, please make sure you're backing up your data and keeping it elsewhere. Okay. So other options to consider, like I said, those are kind of the 2 big main forks in the road, the on-prem upgrade and the to the cloud migration. But depending on your workloads, you may be able to do some other things, right? Maybe SharePoint was overkill for you. Microsoft Teams, and I'm calling this a hardcore collaboration tool with a very polished UI and a high level of extensibility. And I've also called it the best thing to come from Microsoft since Minesweeper. Yes, the game from Windows 3.1. That's really a great tool for collaboration. And I'll talk a little bit specifically about Teams in a moment. I'm sure everybody on this call has had some exposure to it because the pandemic really gave this thing a lot of life very quickly, but it is a really good product. Users seem to really like it. So if your like sole purpose in your SharePoint life was to provide like an online collaboration tool to work groups, and you were filling that void with SharePoint, Teams is probably an option that you should be looking at to get out of the SharePoint business. Next, I would say, and this is going to be probably a lot less common, Microsoft OneDrive. Simple file sharing and collaboration options. And, that's basically like I move file shares to the cloud. It's going to be bulk storage. I can still do things like sharing. I can still edit documents in, Office Online kind of thing. So there are some value adds there. I don't know a lot of people that actually just really moved file shares into SharePoint and kind of called it a day. So my guess is if you're concerned about getting rid of SharePoint, this probably isn't your exit strategy, but I did want to include it. There's also some third-party solutions that I'm not going to cover in detail. The first one I'll mention is Ellucian, for probably 18 months, has had a product available called the Ellucian Experience, which is a very lightweight portal. And that's going to be like calendars, events, announcements. Students are going to be able to retrieve some data as they might have been in like the portal self-service web part, which was basically web advisor data. And it definitely seems like a good replacement for like the mobile app, for instance. That's kind of the impression and the feedback that we've gotten there. There's also some dedicated intranet tools from third parties. Like if I want to set up a really lightweight portal with just some landing pages and do events and announcements, there are a handful of vendors out there doing that kind of thing. And I'm not going to get into that in detail because we've only got like an hour here, but there are things like that out in the marketplace. If you really want to lighten the load and just get down to like, I've got an intranet and I'm kind of doing like one-to-many communications. I've got a few people publishing content and everyone else is really just consuming it. So Microsoft Teams is a collaboration tool that brings together voice and video meeting capabilities. So kind of like we're doing on Zoom right now, Microsoft has its own version of that and it works pretty darn well. Document and project collaboration tools. So, we can share documents, we can co-author documents. We've got some project online stuff. We've got Microsoft Planner, which we use quite a bit here at Forelli. We're big fans. Teams also acts as a front end for SharePoint sites. And I've got in parentheses, don't tell your users, because we have gotten a lot of feedback that users really seem to like this Teams thing. Users that didn't like SharePoint. And we don't really want to stop that party. If your users are happy with something and it doesn't have the SharePoint name on it, that is a-okay with us. It's also got the ability to integrate Microsoft and third-party solutions into the UI. Basically, you add additional tabs to increase functionality on your Teams groups. And there are a lot of Microsoft things in there. There's things from a marketplace from third-party providers. The Planner that I mentioned is one of these things. If I spin up a new team, it doesn't automatically come with Planner, but we can add it in. We get a Planner tab, and now we can start doing task management there. So as I mentioned before, we do use this. We're big fans. We've been using it for over a year, and I personally cannot imagine life without it. Okay, so pretend you said, I've researched this Teams thing and I like it. Are there any potential gotchas? Yes, there are. And governance is a big one. This tool can roll out very freely if you just release it into the wild, and it will spread like wildfire. And what I'll add to that, and this is a real world scenario, is I'd done an audit for someone. And basically the theme of the audit was, tell me how many team sites I have and tell me if I have external sharing available on those team sites. And the results I got kind of shocked me. You see that I have 3,200 listed there. And before I gave them the results, I asked how many they expected they would have. And they said about 300 was their guess. So they had 10 times that actually there. And it's when we got into looking at these and spot checking them, it seemed very much like, Jeremy decided to work with Kelly and collaborate on some documents. Then another day, Jeremy decided to go work with Jessica on some documents and spin up another team site. That's not necessarily a problem in itself because you don't really manage that storage. But if you're trying to keep a clean environment, you might have to clean that stuff up someday. And that's going to definitely be some overhead there. So we recommend putting some governance into place that, covers who should be able to provision a site and when. Maybe you turn self-service site creation off and these requests have to funnel through IT and somebody needs to provide members of the group and a justification for why they need it. That might cut down some of the excess and formalize that process. Also, define what the appropriate use case for a team site is. Team sites are great for collaboration, 5, 10, 100 people. If we're collaborating on something and it's all of us making edits and talking back and forth, that's a great use for that. But if I get into sort of like a one-to-many, communication scenario, my example is always human resources site, right? Because every school with a portal's got a human resources site that's going to post up, employee information, benefits information, things like that. Somebody in the human resources office, or perhaps multiple people in the human resources office, they're the only ones that have ability to edit that content. But when they put it out there, all your employees, all your faculty and staff, they have read access there. And that's more of like a one-to-many kind of mass communication strategy. Teams not your best option for that. So, just define your use cases that are appropriate for a team site and then make sure those justifications match it. Also, who can use it? Users in our organization. Are there subsets of those users that can use it? Maybe, faculty and staff can, students can't. Am I going to allow users from the outside world in any scenario? Make those decisions. This isn't like, hardcore, you've got to like have governance meetings once a month with like a committee of 20. I think a lot of it's just kind of common sense, at least launch it with a policy kind of thing and cover the basics. And once again, be aware that under the hood, this team is creating a SharePoint site in SharePoint Online to store its files and content. So users who know where to look are going to be able to find this in SharePoint as well. So Teams is not the only interface where like your documents and your lists and your list items are actually going to live. They can see it via another avenue. Okay, so Microsoft OneDrive, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. If SharePoint was overkill for my organization, SharePoint was overkill for my organization. All we really needed was a place to store bulk files and edit in the browser. Well, if that statement resonates with you, OneDrive could be your go-to. It's bulk storage, and it's going to allow some value adds like the editing and the co-authoring via Office Online that I spoke of earlier. Okay, so how do we make decisions around this? I would say initially, take stock and prioritize. Create a list of your workloads and your needs. Do you need an intranet or a portal? And if so, for what constituencies? Is it for students? Is it for faculty, staff? Does it include friends and alumni? So define that need. And do you need to continue your use of a Lucian portal and or ILP? As we talked about, it's not going to the cloud if you move there. So if you need it, that's kind of a deal breaker. You have InfoPath forms and SharePoint workflows on-prem. So the deal with InfoPath and SharePoint 2010 style workflows, and that's kind of the legacy workflow that a lot of people still use. They're supported for now, but Microsoft has been promising to disable them in SharePoint Online for a long time. And at some point that day is going to come. I have faith that, they will shut it off at some point. And they've already begun to disable the access of design tools for that stuff. So if you migrate an InfoPath form today and it works today, great. But if you need to make an edit to it, you can't edit it anymore. Like that has become really, really difficult to do. So we're basically saying you probably shouldn't move your InfoPath forms there. If you've got the desire to recode that stuff and rebuild it in like the Power Platform where you're using like Microsoft's form products and their new flow products, great, but that could be a substantial investment as well. So just be aware of that. Make sure to assess that when you're taking stock. My users need a place to collaborate on documents and projects. I think most people need this. It probably just depends on how much of it you want to do and how formal you want to make it. Do you have time and money into custom developed solutions or have invested in mission critical third-party solutions? In addition to making these WSPs that I talked about earlier, you can buy these from any number of vendors. I mean, I see stuff out there from like Bamboo Solutions and Armin Engineering, and there's a couple of the common ones. That stuff goes away. Okay, so kind of a reiteration, but if you're leaning towards SharePoint Online, give yourself a sanity check. Are you okay with, and do you have the resources to rebuild and restructure your content potentially, rebuild existing forms and workflows, move forward without your Lucian or other third-party solutions or custom developed solutions? And if you're leaning towards staying on-prem, give yourself another sanity check by asking yourself if you're okay with rebuilding your SharePoint infrastructure and properly allocating data center resources to it. Like we said, big footprint, it's kind of an investment. Are you okay with implementing the proper security and disaster recovery policies that this stuff needs? Once again, it's kind of complicated, less complicated in the cloud for the most part, but you've got to make sure that you cross those T's and dot those I's. Dedicate staff or engage a vendor to properly maintain this investment. Truly, it's kind of a special skill set. We touched on that earlier. Do you still want to be dedicating staff to dealing with your SharePoint on-prem problems, nightmares. Different people might characterize that different ways. And if not now, how long do you want to stay on-prem? There is this notion that maybe you could stay on-prem for another generation and use that time to formulate a strategy to start moving to the cloud. I'll give the example of maybe I've got, 60 forms that are really valuable and they're in InfoPath and I've got to recode them. There's nothing that prevents you from like rebuilding your forms one by one as time permits and moving them to the cloud on an ad hoc basis. And maybe 3 years from now, you find out your forms are all migrated and you are in a good place to move all of your remaining content to the cloud. So hybrid solutions, as with many other things in the technology landscape, there are easy wins to achieve with a hybrid approach. So for example, you could keep SharePoint on-prem while you move your on-prem team sites to Microsoft Teams. Almost everybody has team sites that I work with in some shape or form. That could be an easy win. Get rid of that /teams out of your on-prem taxonomy, migrate it to Teams, and you've kind of just in a way made yourself a little bit more ready to move to the cloud down the road. I gave the example of forms and workflows already, but I restate it here. And relocate user personal sites, my sites, to OneDrive and Delve. Not terribly uncommon that schools have these my sites, which are basically personal sites and profile pages for users. They don't get a lot of use, but if you for some reason need those, it is very easy to redirect those to OneDrive. So when a user clicks on their name in SharePoint on-prem, it takes them to their OneDrive storage. And if another user clicks on their name to view their profile information, it goes to a page in something called Delve, which is actually a pretty groomed, nice looking page that'll have some information about that user and maybe some things that you and that user have in common, like documents that you've collaborated on, committees you both belong to, things like that. Okay, so my parting thoughts are, I do believe SharePoint on-prem can be much less of a headache when it's properly configured in the first place. I've been with Forelli for almost 5 years and I have responded to hundreds, if not thousands of SharePoint service requests. And a lot of these requests go back to, how the environment was originally installed or configured. There's just a lot of things SharePoint wants done absolutely properly in the Microsoft best practices way, and then it's happy. Other times, it can be kind of a nightmare and an ongoing nightmare. So getting your installation right on-prem the first time, I think, takes a lot of the headache out of having an on-prem environment. We did one 2016 migration. In fact, it was the second one that I had done, first school that I'd done that was using a Lucian portal. And they said their administrative overhead had gone way down on SharePoint, and they were very, very happy with it. So there are success stories out there for this stuff. So I would just, throw that out there as kind of a disclaimer over the doom and gloom with SharePoint on-prem. Microsoft does also offer a tool called Office Online Server that allows SharePoint on-prem and other systems on-prem to edit documents in the browser as they would on SharePoint Online. That's your Word, Excel, and PowerPoint stuff. Finally, Web Advisor slated for retirement on 12/31 of this year. Unofficially, I've had multiple clients tell me that Lucian's told them not to worry, and we've seen literature mentioning that Web API is a replacement that's coming to take over for the Web Advisor integration. We just haven't heard anything official on that yet, so keep that in mind in your decision making. I want to do a decision tree on this stuff because I know it's complicated subject matter. And if you'd like a copy of that when it's done, just reach out to us and we'll be sure to send it to you. But I do envision that it's going to be some of the things we talked about today, along with like 20 or 30 other things that you go down a chart and say yes, no. And at the end of it, you kind of get some recommendations. Also, I'm kind of a chatty guy. I'm not stingy with my time. If you feel like you've got a case you want to go over with us at all, reach out. We're not real high pressure people. Happy to have those conversations, look at what you've got and maybe kind of steer you in a direction. So my email's there on the screen. You can reach out to me. If you have a Forelli account manager, you can reach out to them. And at the end of this slide, I think there's a what's happening page link that's also got some contact information for Forelli. That does it for me. Thank you for listening for this almost whole hour. I really appreciate your time.
Jeremy. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to come off mute. I'll be reading some from the chat. Jeremy, Joe asks, does the Lucian experience replace the Lucian portal built on SharePoint?
I'm going to go ahead and say no to that. I've sat in on 2 demos of it, and it seemed like a promising product, but very, very lightweight. I would say probably a good replacement for the mobile app, and maybe some of the web advisor exposed data that you get in your portal. But if you're doing other things in your portal, other workloads, especially like collaboration or the ability of people to make publishing sites or department sites, that's gone. Forms workflows, not there. So yeah, I would say partially, but not a whole replacement.
Could you elaborate a little more on the solution to constituency, faculty, staff versus students redirect for SPO? Would you elaborate more on the hub concept you mentioned for SPO, and is that the answer to it?
No. So I do believe that if you actually want to do true constituency redirection, we're probably going to be writing some custom scripting on a landing page. I have yet to see a third-party solution that actually handles that. Obviously, you're familiar with it from Ellucian's delivered, and there's some third-party tools that do that I actually think Ellucian boosted pretty heavily from in designing theirs. I haven't seen one that harnesses that client-side object model for development that I alluded to as the SharePoint Online development model. So you can't deploy that stuff there. I think your only real solution is probably going to be that you have a root intranet site that nobody ever sees that has a code snippet on that page that takes a look at like a group membership or a field and redirects based on that. The other one was the hub, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Could you elaborate more on the hub concept you mentioned for SPO? And is that the answer to it?
It's not the answer to it, but I would say it would help. SharePoint Online, like right out of the box, seems to want to create all your sites in this like /sites container. So I think it's good to take a look at that before you even get started and say, okay, I want some other containers. I want to /departments. I want to /students, and start putting some of your sites in there so you can keep your taxonomy a little bit cleaner. Within that, I do think the hub sites are going to be like a central management point for your branding and navigation. Like, let's say I've got a fact staff landing page and a student's landing page, and I've got a bunch of employee sites that like students shouldn't see, and I've got a bunch of student sites that like maybe employees can see, but it's going to have separate branding. I've done a little flashier branding for my students. That hub site's going to help me make that a reality and implement that. And I'm going to have one central place to manage it. And once the site's included in that group of hub sites, I can update it one place and it's going to translate to those sites that are attached.
And this next question, as you look into your crystal ball, Jeremy. So Joe asked, do you expect any major announcement during eLive around the portal?
I couldn't tell you. I wish I had that information. I would be, I've thought about corporate espionage a couple of times. We just haven't pulled the trigger on that one, but no, I don't have anything official from Ellucian that I could comment on.
Okay, next question's from Bruce. So is the Ellucian mobile app going away?
Do you know the answer to that one, Kelly? I thought they were doing a new version.
Yep, there's still development going on that platform. I know a lot of schools have found it hard to embrace just because app technology isn't as necessary as it used to be, where mobile apps are friendlier from a development standpoint and are pretty extensible now where they weren't, just a few years ago.
Okay.
Another question, when using the attach the database upgrading SharePoint 2013 to SharePoint 2016 approach, do security groups and permission settings also get carried over along with the content? Are there any other items we need to redo after using the attach the database approach?
That is an excellent question. All of your existing security will come over with it. So that stuff is contained within your content database. It's actually contained within your site collection in that content database. Site collections, your security boundary. Because of that, your permissions are going to come over with it, so you don't have to worry about that. If you do have third-party WSPs, so here's kind of what happens, and I'll try to keep it brief. If I migrate my content database over and I have content that has a dependency on something from that WSP, maybe I have a web part on a page. That page has a reference to that web parts definition in the WSP, for lack of a better term. You're actually going to get warnings that when you migrate your data that say, hey, I've got content that requires this feature to be installed and I don't see it installed on 2016. So yes, you do have to redeploy your WSPs on 2016. It's not a bad process. If you ask nice, I've even got some PowerShell that sucks out your existing WSPs from SharePoint 2013 and puts them back in 16, because not everybody kept track of their WSPs. I've had people not being able to find them, and there is a way to recover them from the database once they're installed. Okay, I think I've got that question.
Okay, so the next question is for SharePoint 2013 environments. Using that crystal ball again, what do you think is the last date possible for making a decision for migrating to SharePoint Online or to SharePoint 2016? When's that last date for the decision tree, Jeremy?
You know, I'm going to say whenever your last piece of software really falls off of like end of life. Ellucian hasn't put out updates for the Ellucian portal in quite some time. If you're totally up to date on that, you're on 4.2.2. If you've got SharePoint 2013 installed on server 2012 R2 and you've got a little bit of time left on that, that could be your deciding factor. I'm not getting updates for 2012 R2 anymore. Depending on what SQL version you're using, if that becomes end of life and you can't patch it anymore, that might be your last day. As far as SharePoint 2013, I forget the exact date on that, but I want to say it's late 2022 for end of life. And I do actually expect that, like they've done in past versions of SharePoint for like 2010, you'll probably still be able to get CUs for it after the end of life date. I've been seeing that go on with SharePoint for quite a while.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Looks like chat slowed down a little bit. You can also come off mute.
They know I'm getting hoarse.
Okay.
Jeremy, I got one more question, Jeremy. About a year ago, my school went with Google for its email and document sharing and so on, and Google Tools or Google Apps or whatever. Is there any reason why you'd want to stay on some sort of SharePoint model if you're at the core, you're kind of a Google school? That makes sense.
It does make sense. I guess I would just say if Google has like an intranet type product, I'm not really aware of it. When we used Google internally, and that was kind of my biggest exposure to like G Suite in general before we made the switch. Yeah, we had our Google Docs stuff, we had some other collaboration tools and things, but I don't think we had like an actual like intranet type product in that platform. Does that sound accurate to people with more Google knowledge than I have? I don't think they play in that space.
So you went from G Suite to Teams?
We went from G Suite to like the entire Microsoft stack. Yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of what I'm familiar with. I came from the Microsoft stack. We were building all that out, and here at Hawkeye, they made the reverse of going from Microsoft to Google, and yeah. So I'm just trying to figure out, well, how do you centralize around that, or how do you, I don't know.
Well, and I'll just warn you in advance too, Joe, there's now schools looking at going from Google to Microsoft just because of, first and foremost, the extra security features that are available in Microsoft, especially the DLP stuff that Jeremy mentioned in the presentation. Extra features around e-discovery security was the reason we actually made the move. But then Google is also talking about limiting space, which schools tended to use Google because there was unlimited capacity for storage. And now they're starting to cap that. And so we're starting to see clients looking at making that switch back from Google to Microsoft. And, it's just those two titans fighting it out.
Yeah. And in the last, I don't know, probably 3 to 6 months, we've had multiple requests for like Google to Microsoft migrations, and I haven't had any go the other way. And I try to stay like pretty agnostic on this stuff. Like I recognize Google's a great platform and all that stuff. But I think my impression of the Microsoft stack is that it tends to be more enterprise friendly. Like Kelly said, with all these security tools, I even saw like the Azure SSO thing be like somebody's like trigger point to be like, all right, I'm moving everything back. This is like too cool that I can like do all this under like one umbrella. So,
Sure.
I guess I go back to what I'd say is like analyze your workloads, make sure your needs are being met, look at the costs. The Microsoft really, I don't know who made them mad, but they got out of bed and just started kicking butt with this stuff. I mean, That's just my opinion, but it's how I think
so
it
we're
is.
bucking the trend, obviously. So would Deferelli make all of my SharePoint problems go away?
What are your problems? Let's have a side conversation.
The problem is that I have a problem. I just don't want to have a problem. So I don't, our SharePoint, I have no idea where we're at with it. I've never touched it. I've been here for over a year now, and I have a feeling it's just kind of, it's in the back room. It's powered on and it's limping along.
Well, and I do see this. I mean, I've really got this in my head that like people got on to like an on-prem portal. Like I can just envision like these Eleusian sales meetings where like, if you build it, they will come. We're going to stand this up and your life's going to be great.
Yeah.
And, I look at people's user stats and I watch them like fall year over year, unique visitors per day trending down. And it's like, you've got to give your users something compelling to come back to. And, I had a student in a
We haven't done that here. So
it's tough. I had this student in a focus group recently tell me like, we basically asked like, what do you want in a portal? And he gave like the greatest answer I've ever heard. And he said, I want my portal to feel like the digital equivalent of being on campus. I want the colors and the branding reflective of like walking through these hallways. I want every office to have a site that I can go to and interact. Like I don't have to walk into the registrar's office. I can go to the registrar's site in the portal kind of thing. And that kind of resonated with me. And I think we've like all of us Forelli schools, we've got a lot of work to do in getting there.
And, it's another tagline for Forelli, right? Making headaches go away since 2002.
Yeah, but
perfect.
Joseph, if
Sign
you
me
do
up.
want to have a side conversation, just let us know and we can kind of talk about your situation.
I have a feeling, we'll
Okay.
probably need to.
All right, sounds good.
Another question from chat: when migrating team sites from SharePoint on-premise to online, I recall seeing that the permissions groups came over and were created, but I didn't think it populated with users in those groups, generally rendering those groups useless. Have you seen differently?
Yes, but I've seen it in other tools like DocAv and ShareGate. And never mind, we'll take that offline, Christine. I actually thought I had a thought on that, but thank you so much. I'm sorry, I gave a shout out. I know lots of people here, but hi, Christine. Hi, Molly. Christine and Molly are my first Forelli customers from the time I joined this company. We've been hanging out for close to 5 years now.
And we're the best.
The original always is.
OG Jeremy clients. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, as Jeremy mentioned, we are a very opinionated and very chatty group here. So we're always open to a call. Check out our What's Happening page to see our upcoming webinars, as well as previously recorded webinars. As I've said, we've had this series going for over a year now. So there's lots of things up there. And if you do have any questions or have any ideas for upcoming webinars, feel free to reach out to us at info@forelli.com and we can take care of you from there. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. I appreciate your time. Yeah, thanks, Yuan. Thanks, Jimmy.